Hi there. I should start by apologizing. As I make this video, there are repair persons around, so you might hear loud voices and other sounds in the background. I hope you'll bear with me. In part 2 of the series on international trade, I focused on describing the US-China trade war, including the technological war. Today, I want to return to the US-China trade war, but discuss it through a strategic lens. For this discussion, I want to use the framework of infinite games. So, what is an infinite game? Infinite games are games that have no endpoint or clear winner. Instead, they are played to continue the play itself, often with the goal of outlasting the opponent. These types of games can be found in various aspects of life, such as business and politics. Before I continue, however, do visit our website where I curate news and publications from international financial organizations and world central banks. Topics cover a wide range of financial and economic issues that affect individual countries or the world economy. For instance, COVID-19, inflation, or the war in Ukraine. Please also subscribe to this channel and be informed whenever we publish a new video. To succeed in infinite games, players must be able to adapt to changing circumstances, think creatively, and build sustainable strategies that can be sustained over a long period. One example of an infinite game is the business world. In this context, companies are constantly competing for market share and profitability. However, unlike in a finite game where the goal is to achieve a specific outcome, in the business world, the goal is to remain in business for as long as possible. To do this, companies must focus on building sustainable strategies that can withstand changes in the market and economic conditions. Playing to outlast the opponent in the business world means taking a long-term view of the company's success. This may involve investing in research and development, building strong relationships with customers and suppliers, and creating a corporate culture that fosters innovation and adaptability. Companies that are successful in playing to outlast their opponents are those that can pivot when necessary and anticipate and respond to changes in the market. Another example of an infinite game is politics. In this context, political parties are constantly vying for power and influence. However, unlike in a finite game where the goal is to win an election, in politics, the game is to remain relevant and influential over the long term. To do this, political parties must build broad coalitions, develop policies that resonate with the electorate, and be responsive to changing social and economic conditions. Playing to outlast the opponent in politics means taking a long-term view of the party's success. This may involve building strong relationships with other parties and interest groups, developing policies that are adaptable to changing social and economic conditions, and fostering a culture of inclusivity and collaboration. Parties that are successful in playing to outlast their opponents are those that can adapt to changing political landscapes and remain relevant to the concerns of the electorate. Global politics is an infinite game with no clear endpoint or winning condition. The objective of global political strategies is not to win, but to promote the long-term sustainability and stability of the international system. This requires a different mindset than in finite games, where the goal is to achieve a specific outcome. One of the key strategies for an infinite game in global politics is building strong relationships and partnerships between nations. In an infinite game, the objective is not to defeat or dominate other nations, but to cooperate and collaborate to promote common interests and values. This requires building trust and understanding between nations, which can be accomplished through diplomatic initiatives, trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, and other forms of international engagement. Another important strategy for an infinite game in global politics is the promotion of sustainable development and environmental stewardship. The international system is facing significant challenges related to climate change, natural resource depletion, and other environmental issues. To address these challenges and promote long-term sustainability, nations must work together to develop policies and programs that promote sustainable economic growth, protect natural resources, and mitigate the impact of climate change. A third strategy for an infinite game in global politics is the promotion of human rights and democratic values. The international system is built on the principles of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. To promote long-term stability and sustainability, nations must work together to protect these values, uphold international norms and standards, and promote the rights and dignity of all individuals. A fourth strategy for an infinite game in global politics is the promotion of international cooperation and collaboration on issues of global concern. Global challenges such as terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and pandemics require international cooperation and collaboration to address effectively. To promote long-term stability and sustainability, nations must work together to develop strategies and programs that address these challenges in a coordinated and effective manner. A fifth strategy for an infinite game in global politics is the promotion of innovation and technological development. The international system is constantly evolving, and nations must be able to adapt to new technological and social changes to remain relevant and effective. To promote long-term stability and sustainability, nations must invest in research and development and encourage innovation and creativity and promote the adoption of new technologies and practices. The US-China trade and chip war is an ongoing conflict between the world's two largest economies, with major implications for the global technology industry. The conflict revolves around several issues, including intellectual property theft, trade imbalances, and the growing competition for control of the global semiconductor market. The US-China trade and chip war can be seen as an example of an infinite game, where the objective is not to win, but to sustain the competition over the long term. Both sides are aware that any short-term gains or losses may be offset by long-term consequences, making the game more complex and dynamic. Therefore, both sides must employ strategies that not only optimize their own interests, but also consider the actions of their opponent and their potential for long-term cooperation. It's difficult to say for sure whether the US and China are both fully aware that they are playing an infinite game in the trade and chip war. While the infinite game provides a useful framework for understanding the conflict, it's unclear to what extent policymakers on both sides are explicitly using infinite game concepts to guide their decision making. That being said, both the US and China are likely aware of the long-term implications of their actions and are taking steps to sustain the competition over the long term. For example, both sides have made significant investments in domestic semiconductor production and are working to reduce their reliance on foreign suppliers. This suggests that they are taking a long-term perspective and recognizing the importance of maintaining strategic capabilities in the semiconductor industry. One of the key strategies employed by both sides is tit-for-tat retaliation. This strategy involves responding to an opponent's actions with a similar action of equal or greater magnitude, creating a cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation. For example, when the US imposed tariffs on Chinese imports, China responded with tariffs of its own. This strategy is based on the principle of reciprocity and the assumption that the opponent will act in a similar way, leading to a stable and predictable outcome over the long term. Another important strategy is signaling. This involves sending messages to the opponent about one's intentions and capabilities, which can influence their actions and behavior. For example, the US had signaled its willingness to use export controls and other measures to limit China's access to critical semiconductor technologies. China, in turn, had signaled its intention to invest heavily in domestic semiconductor production and reduce its reliance on foreign suppliers. Signaling can help to build trust and deter aggressive actions, but it can also be used to mislead or deceive the opponent. A third strategy is cooperation and negotiation. This involves working with the opponent to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes and resolve conflicts. Cooperation and negotiation can be challenging in the context of the US-China trade and chip war, given the long-standing mistrust and deep ideological differences between the two sides. However, there have been some efforts to negotiate a trade deal or establish a framework for cooperation on issues such as intellectual property protection and technology transfer. This mistrust can also be seen in the recent episode of the so-called Chinese spy balloon, which the US shot down over the Atlantic after it had traversed the length of continental US. This has caused tension on both sides and resulted in a cancelled China visit by the US Secretary of State Blinken. China, for its part, accused the US of overreaction to what it termed a weather balloon that had been blown off course by winds. A fourth strategy is escalation and brinkmanship. This involves taking bold and aggressive actions to force the opponent to back down or concede to one's demands. For example, the US has threatened to ban Chinese companies such as Huawei from accessing critical semiconductor technologies, while China has warned of retaliation and escalation if such actions are taken. Escalation and brinkmanship can be effective in achieving short-term gains, but they also increase the risk of conflict and lead to uncertainty, instability. To conclude, while it's unclear whether the US and China are explicitly using infinite game concepts to guide their decision-making in the trade and chip war, it's likely that they are aware of the long-term implications of their actions and are taking steps to sustain the competition over the long term. The US-China trade and chip war is a complex and dynamic conflict that requires an infinite game perspective to fully understand. The strategies employed by both sides, including tit-for-tat retaliation, signaling, cooperation and negotiation, and escalation and brinkmanship, are shaped by the underlying dynamics of the infinite game. By understanding these strategies and their implications, policymakers and business leaders can develop more effective responses to the ongoing conflict and promote long-term stability and cooperation in the global technology industry.